All right. That was maybe the fanciest thing I've ever been a part of, Nijay. So,
Yes, yes. We do it
well,
right.
hey, yeah. Hey, friends, thanks for joining us. This is a webinar brought to you all by Northern Seminary, and I'm really excited to be a part of it because I am a Northern alum. Nijay was my professor,
Woohoo.
hooded me not too long ago, about a year ago. And today we're coming to you to talk about one of Nijay's new books. And so I'm going to read off the paper because the subtitle is long and I don't want to get it wrong. But I loved this book, by
Guilty.
the way. It's called Paul for the World, a grounded vision for finding meaning in this life, not just the next. And you can see there it's from Brazos, a part of Baker Publishing Group. And so, Nijay, thanks for being a part of it. You guys will see the QR code there that I know they just flashed up if you want to buy it. I highly recommend this book. And so, Northern Brazos, thank you so much for hosting us with this webinar. But Nijay, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. It's so fun to work with you again, at least for this hour, and I'm excited to talk about this book.
Yeah. For those of you who are listening in, I used to be one of Nijay's TAs. So this brings back very fond memories of us sitting on laptops talking about things of the Lord. So, well, let's jump into it, Nijay. How would you? Let's just set the table for those who maybe are just hopping on because they love you and they didn't even know you had a new book. So, how would you describe your book in a couple of sentences?
First of all, those that didn't know about a new book, how dare you? No, I'm just kidding. The brief take on this, the elevator pitch is, when you read the big books on Paul's theology by the luminaries like James D.G. Dunn or N.T. Wright or Douglas Moo, they tend to focus on the big ologies: Christology, pneumatology, ecclesiology, eschatology, final judgment, soteriology. And those things are important. I don't want to downplay those things. But when you actually sit and read Paul's letters, my tendency when I was younger was to skip past the stuff that was mundane. The stuff at the beginning of the letter, the stuff at the end of the letter, and just look for the meat. And the meat's like 1 Corinthians 15, or the meat is the Christ hymn, or, the things that prove the divinity of Christ. All good stuff. But I work with seminary students. You're one of them. And just in the last few years, students have come to me with more this worldly questions. What does Paul think about poverty? What does Paul think about? One student asked me, what does Paul think about the neighborhood? I've literally never thought of that before until that student said, can I study Paul in the neighborhood? What does Paul think about racism, which is a very deeply penetrating issue in our life today? I've had students ask about friendship, anxiety, wellness, and that got me down the track of thinking, why don't I know a go-to book on these subjects? Like, how is it possible? And I think what I'm trying to do here is what I call an inverted Pauline theology. Most Pauline theologies are trying to suck us up into the stratosphere in order to be in the clouds with, the saints, thinking about holy, important things. And I wanted to flip the script and say, what if it's not about getting to heaven? What if it's about actually bringing heaven to earth? I did steal that from N.T. Wright, but I think it's helpful rethinking Paul.
Yeah, that's good. When you were just naming the ologies, I thought you were reading my transcript because it sounds like my entire master's program. So, well, I think you do a really good job actually of what you just said you hope the book would be. And really your book is two parts. The first part is where you lay your theological groundwork for why you think this is important. And then the second half is where you get into those particular issues. But your first part, you use this term holy worldliness. And I know you get it a little bit from Paul and one of your heroes, Bonhoeffer. So why don't you tell us what you mean when you use that word and why you settled on that term?
Yeah, I want to give a little background, then I'm going to jump into that. The background is I grew up in a type of evangelicalism that was very anti-world. I wasn't allowed to. We weren't supposed to use playing cards. We had to do Dutch Blitz, if you know what Dutch Blitz is. The Dutch Blitz cards, the kind of Pennsylvania Amish sort of safe gambling. I mean, safe card playing. And we weren't supposed to go to dances. We weren't supposed to listen to secular music. It was very world renouncing. There's a kernel of good things in that in terms of being careful what you consume and all of that. But I received the message of like, this world is dirty and evil. And that you could establish a very strict, sacred, secular divide. Go to Christian movies, not secular movies. Listen to Christian music. And that church was the good place. and the stuff outside of church was either unimportant, irrelevant, or bad. And this reflected how we looked at the world. I mean, as a young person, I remember the Heaven's Gate mass suicide that happened in Southern California, where a group of people killed themselves en masse, hoping to catch a comet, an actual comet, to a more spiritual plane. And even the way we share Jesus, I used to do door-to-door evangelism with my church in high school, and we would ask people, our gospel pitch was, when we talk to an unbeliever, how certain are you that you will go to heaven when you die? Now, what happens, after you die is important. I think it's hugely important, and it should be preached on. It should be taught. But I don't know I don't think that should be your opening pitch. I don't think, because I think that sends a message about this world that, gosh, we're just waiting to get out of here, twiddling our thumbs. So back to worldliness. I actually get this language, as you mentioned, from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Bonhoeffer lived in a time almost 100 years ago. It's crazy to think about. We're coming up on that 100-year anniversary in not too many years. He lived in a time where he was fighting Hitler and the Third Reich, and you had this thing called two kingdoms theology. Two kingdoms theology comes from Luther and says there's the sort of spiritual realm of pastors and religion, and then there's the mundane realm of politics and government, and the two really shouldn't mess with each other. Now, taken to an extreme, you get things like apartheid, where churches were saying we can't get involved because it's not our territory. And you had these group of churches, they were called the Confessing Church, and they were meant to stand over and against the Third Reich, the Reich Church. But Bonhoeffer was disappointed, but that by the end of, sort of his struggle with the Third Reich, the Confessing Church kind of had words to say about the bad things going on, but they kind of just hid in their churches. At least that's the way he represented it. And so they didn't want to get dirty with all the worldliness, right? And so Bonhoeffer did some writing in prison where he said, actually, we shouldn't try to be less worldly. The incarnation and the suffering and death of Jesus teach us to be more worldly in the sense of bringing the gospel deeper into enemy territory, deeper into the misery of people in this world, to redeem it, to bring it hope, to bring it life and breath and air. And so I throw Apollinism in there, holy, almost as an oxymoron, because we think of worldliness as bad. So I'm throwing in the word holy to say, can we rethink how we think about the world? My daughter and I love to sing in the car. We sing this song, you can have all this world, give me Jesus. And I understand what they're getting at when they sing that. What I want to sing is, you can't have this world. This world belongs to Jesus. Give me the world back, but but put Jesus in there. So I'm trying to do that using Paul.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things you emphasized I thought was really good was there's this, you really argue that the belief that we can bring redemption to this world because of Jesus. And so I want to talk about that because you do a good job of explaining, especially the Corinthians. You kind of use them as a source quite a bit in the book, which is awesome. Because if there was one funky church that I'd like to visit, it'd probably be them for me to be like, what are y'all doing? But you name the influences that would cause an average Greco-Roman person to not think much of this life or even devalue the next life. But I'm curious, you talked about your experience where people really were fearful of this world. What do you think influences so many Christians who believe the entire emphasis is on the next life, not this one? What do you think influences us today to push us in that direction?
For sure. I mean, there's something about the history of Christianity and maybe the terminology we use about heaven and going to heaven. I was in this, I was sitting in a seminar that N.T. Wright was teaching, and the moderator kept asking questions about heaven, and Wright kept correcting him and saying, you mean the new heavens and new earth? And it was almost comical because this moderator knows better, but keeps slipping into that language of like, eternity in heaven, eternity in heaven, eternity in heaven. So I think it's just ingrained in us. It's in so much of the hymns and the liturgy that we're used to, that it just, the art that we see about, I don't connect with a lot of Christian art because it's so exotic and
Mm.
otherworldly, I look at that and I say, that doesn't look fun. That doesn't look joyful. Like I want to roll up my sleeves. I want to live life. I want to live life to the fullest as a human in God's world. So I think that's part of it. What's going on with the Corinthians is really interesting because I use kind of three models. Two are bad and one is good. And the Corinthians showcase some of this. So one of the bad models is holy otherworldliness, a preoccupation with what's going on up there. And we see this, for example, with the Colossians, where they're kind of obsessed with angel worship and other things. We see this all over the place. Another option is unholy worldliness, where the Corinthians are trying to abuse spiritual resources to make themselves great in this world. We see this especially highlighted in the face-off between tongues and prophecy. Now, I remember before I'd studied 1 Corinthians, I just thought this was all weird. I didn't really want to touch it with a 100-foot pole because I didn't understand what was going on. But once I really got a better understanding of what's going on, it makes a whole lot of sense what Paul's doing here. He says all the gifts are good. Strive for some of the greater gifts. Paul says, I speak in tongues. So he has nothing against tongues. What he didn't like is that people were abusing that gift to try to make a name for themselves. Now, I take this as like this unique ability to communicate in a angelic or heavenly language. And it's hard for many of us who aren't in, Pentecostal circles, who don't quite understand this, to connect with this. But think about someone at church who has just an incredible singing voice, just one in a million singing voice. And think how easy it is for that person to become kind of an object of attention. And you think about our worship music industry and all of that, right? And so you could take this gift God has given you and you could twist it around to become a celebrity, twist it around to make money, twist it around to make too much money. And I think this was happening with tongues. And Paul says, no, I would rather you speak in prophecy. Why? Tongues mostly edifies self. That's what he's saying. Like, it's this great thing, like for sure, but it mostly edifies self. But prophecy is a word that God has uniquely given you to challenge or encourage a community to build it up. So what was happening to the Corinthians, they're like, we don't care what it's for. We just want to know whether it's impressive. And Paul says, this church is really gifted. Like, you're one of the most talented churches I've ever seen. But instead of using this to support each other, using this over and against each other. I actually used this really bizarre image that I made up for this. Imagine you had a contest at church about who's the tallest, right? Ludicrous, right? That's kind of what's going on in Corinth.
Yeah.
And so one week people, you kind of measure people, but then people say, well, I want to prove myself tallest. And the next week people come in with like thicker soles. Then the next week, high heels. Then the next week, stilts. And that image that seems so crazy is actually very similar to what was going on in Corinth. Is they were obsessed over self-importance and manipulating these resources. And Paul's trying to say, not unholy worldliness, not holy otherworldliness, but holy worldliness, drawing these gifts that have been given to us to love and serve and to transform this world the way God has wanted it to be.
Yeah, it's so good. I can't imagine churches today struggling with either of those things. So, hey, for those of y'all that are listening in, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, so forgive me. If you have questions that pop up, throw them in the chat. We have somebody moderating. There we are. Look at that. Leave your questions in the chat. This is Ralph.
Perfect.
You're so on time. This is the fanciest webinar I've ever been a part of, Nijay. Well, so I think you do a really good job of presenting your argument in the first half of the book, convincing people, hey, actually, this life might matter and there's a lot of work we have to do. And then your second half of your book is you pick 8 topics that you see in Paul's writing that have to do with the stuff of life, right? The stuff on the ground. And so the 8 topics were justice, equality, money, work, friendships, athletics, wellness, and creativity. And I just kept every new chapter. I was like, this is so good. I had not thought about 3 of them at all when I thought of Paul's writing. So I'm curious, as you were starting this book, was there a topic that really surprised you? Maybe you weren't planning to write on it,
Yeah. You know what's funny about, academic writing is often, I've been in this game for a while, so I have a relationship with publishers, a relationship of trust where I pitch a book that I haven't really fully thought through. I just know I want to write on it. And it's sort of a hunch. There's a hunch that I'm like, there's gold over there. Will you let me dig? Will you help me dig for it? So I have a 3/4 baked idea, and then I just started to choose topics and dig in. Gosh, I knew this question was coming. I'll just give you a couple quick ones. One is work.
Mm.
I want to talk about it because it's such an important topic for today. We got AI, we got economic issues. We have sort of class issues, United States, and education issues. So I thought work would be a really important one because we spend so much of our time working. I knew Paul worked, but I actually spent some time thinking about how many occupations are actually mentioned in his letters. And I just started counting, and it was really interesting. I discovered there's a lawyer in there somewhere. There's a city treasurer in there somewhere. Obviously, Paul's a tent maker, and he's got Priscilla and Aquila. So really looking at what are the jobs people are doing. And what's really interesting is the wide variety of jobs that people are doing. Some are slaves, which is horrible, but it's real. Some seem to be really wealthy, powerful people. And a lot of people are just kind of your regular laborers. And so thinking about, like, when Paul's looking at a room of people, he's not looking at intellectuals in a church. He's not looking at quote unquote educated people. He's not looking at what we think of as white collar people. He's looking at mostly blue collar people. He's looking at people that spend all day in a grind that they don't want to be in, that don't feel called to do that work. Nobody feels called to dig ditches or build railroads, whatever. They don't feel called to do those things. They just have to do them. So thinking about work, where Paul says, 1 Thessalonians 4, live a quiet life. Work with your hands and mind your dang business. Like there's so many good truths in there. So the work one was really fun to think through, like, what are the occupations of the people that Paul is rubbing shoulders with, Luke the doctor and other stuff like that. The other one I'll mention is the chapter on the arts. And my hunch there was to dig into Paul as a poet. You got the Christ hymn and Philippians and Colossians and 1 Timothy. But the gold that I didn't realize I'd discover was his use of architectural metaphors. And thinking through what kind of buildings did he see on a regular basis, and how was that an inspiration for his writing, that he would see these beautiful, ornate buildings that are gorgeous. Imagine when you're traveling in the United Arab Emirates or in India or in Europe or in South America, you just see these gorgeous buildings architecturally. And to think Paul's walking around looking at these buildings thinking, that's a symbol for the church. How well are our pastors trained to do that, to walk around and look at the ocean or on a hike or just walking around a cityscape saying these are metaphors for the church. I found that so inspirational.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that because that was one of the chapters that really surprised me. And I was like, oh, this is such a good reminder, which brings me to, it was interesting. You talked about the ologies, sort of, we get sucked up into the high theology of Paul, and then you brought it back down to the ground. And art and beauty aren't something that I think people think of naturally. So I'm curious, as you were writing the book, that chapter probably surprised some people, maybe your publishers, but were there chapters that you thought, I'm going to get some pushback here. I'm going to maybe ruffle some feathers. And I don't know that your art one's going to ruffle feathers, but did you have that experience?
For sure. And so I probably spent a lot of time on those first two on justice, the justice one and then the race one. Solid grounding in Paul for both those subjects, but because of the political divides, especially in America, I was wondering, do I put those at the beginning or the end? If I put them at the end, I'm sort of, sneak attacking people if they're bound to be. But I thought, I'm not hiding anything. There's very clear evidence in Paul for concern about these issues. I just really have to prove it. I really have to, so I really dwell a lot in the justice chapter on the lawsuit issue in Corinth, and that's one of those moments where I did discover a gold mine. I discovered an article by Bruce Winter, who's a really, really well-known Greco-Roman background scholar, and he really talks about just how corrupt the Roman government and justice system were, especially the courts. And the more he taught about the courts, the more I thought, this sounds really familiar, that like the more money you have, the better lawyer you can buy off jurors, you could give favors to the judge. And I just thought, man, times have not changed. There's nothing new under the sun. Rome preached a great talk of justice and liberty, and then the very dark reality that if you don't have money, you have a very low chance of winning against somebody that does. That one, I thought, okay, there's a Greek word, dikaiosune, and it's not that unusual to translate it justice, even though it's commonly translated righteousness. But that's going to ruffle people's feathers to talk about the justice of God versus the righteousness of God. Or I draw off of 2 Corinthians 5, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. But you could say we could be formed into the justice of God. I know that's going to bother people. But a Greek reader, especially with a Jewish background, is going to associate the righteousness of God with truth, justice, and equality. It's just built into the Old Testament. So I thought, and then the race, you could just imagine people are going to say, oh, DEI, DEI, DEI.
Yeah. Well, I appreciated that you moved them to the front, because I appreciate the fact you weren't hiding anything. You weren't going to slip it by. And really, so let's talk about the justice chapter, because I thought it was really strong. And it ends with, you have an anecdote in there where in around 2023, and what, formerly known as Twitter on X, Pope Francis had tweeted out something about social justice, being for it. And then a Christian thought leader kind of replied and was like, no, I don't think so. I think that's more or less like a distraction to the gospel, was kind of the gist of your anecdote. And so I'm curious, because you mentioned dikaiosune. It's too bad we don't have, the Hebrew sort of has two words for justice and righteousness, mishpat and tzedakah, which is very helpful. Yeah. I feel like they get collapsed into one word in the Greek. And so that forces translators, which well, working on the NLT translation, you have to make choices there when you translate it. But outside of vocabulary, why do you think it is so difficult for many Christians, pastors, thought leaders to get on board with this idea of justice when the argument seems so solid, especially after you read your chapter? Why do you think it's so difficult for folks to see justice as an important part of our purpose here?
Yeah, I'll say I'm a proud Protestant and evangelical, but I think some of this is on the reformers, because people like Luther, I actually really like reading Luther, but people like Luther were so fixated on justification as a status, at the same time sinner and justified, that it did obscure, I think, what is very clear in the Old Testament. I mean, read Jeremiah, read Deuteronomy. Justice is all over the place. It's really in the whole Old Testament. And I think it may be a problematic fixation on Paul. I say that as a Paul person myself. Yeah. I'm reading like a 500-page commentary on the book of Revelation right now. And you can't really read the book of Revelation without recognizing judgment, accountability, justice, the problems of how we use money, the problems of exploitation. Justice is all over the book of Revelation. I mean, it is the essence that the Lord is going to pay back. I mean, the whole idea of payback, the Lord is the avenger, is a justice concept. The whole idea of the covenant curses, is a justice concept. Yeah. And so, Bonhoeffer, who I talk about at length in the book, he was in prison, and at some point, he's writing these letters, didn't know they're going to be published, but he's writing these letters to friends, and he at one point he says, I'm not reading the New Testament anymore because it's too kind of like happy and cheery. I'm just reading the Old Testament. It's more gritty and real. So I would say, Nika, I think people need to read the Old Testament more.
Yeah. Well, that's an indictment, since I have a master's in New Testament, a doctorate in New Testament. Maybe I'll check out the Old Testament someday.
Now you got to do a doctorate in Old Testament.
I love it. Yeah, I think honestly, the price of your book would be worth it just for this chapter, because I do think that's what you do so well, is you articulate Paul's vision of justice, which often people argue isn't there. And I would say, I think Paul is a pretty good scholar of the Old Testament. You can see these ideas pull forward, especially in the lawsuits. But okay, your chapter on friendship, I love the way it starts. You talk about the joke that people make that the real miracle of Jesus is having 12 friends in his 30s. Yeah. But I have more or less, I've chosen not to follow that sort of, husband, 2.5 kids, white picket fence life. I've really built my family with friendship. And so you say in the book, friendships are going to be so vital even in the next life. And if that's the case, then they should be vital in this. So now I'm going to ask you to put your pastor hat on. I know you're a New Testament scholar. I know you're an author, but I think there are going to be folks that read that chapter and say, Nijay, I'm so convinced you're right. I'm just really struggling to make friends. So how would you encourage somebody when you read about Paul's view of friendship, how would you encourage somebody to go out and make friends and to realize the value of that in this lifetime?
Yeah. Good question. Let me step back and talk about sort of this theology, the eschaton that I'm operating with, because I kind of do that and then I work backwards. So, it's funny. I have these podcast conversations or webinar conversations after the book is published. And then I realized, I wish I would have said this in the book. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is talk about the human project. What does it mean to be human? The reason I talk about that is we tend, because of paintings, because of bad theology, we tend to think we have one type of life on earth and then we'll have a completely separate type of life in heaven or whatever, in eternity, however you express that. And to me, that doesn't make sense. Why would God create us with all these elements on earth only to just completely abandon them when we go to heaven and we're sitting around doing nothing? That's not true. We're just singing songs all day. That's not true. We don't have any work. We don't have any relationships. We don't have any family. I'm one of these people where, like, if I have a free weekend, and I rarely do, I get so excited. Let's say the kids and my wife are all out somewhere for the weekend. I get excited for probably the first evening. I'm like in my pajamas. I'm like, I get sushi or whatever. I'm excited. I, watch them. And then the next, I'm like miserable because I'm like, I got nothing to do. I got nobody to talk to. So this idea that heaven's just going to be rest and we do nothing, like, so after publishing the book, I came up with, sort of based on the book, three things about what it means to be human. I'm not going to argue if people say there's more than three, but I think these three are clear from things like Genesis 1 and 2. We were made to relate. We're going to come back to that because that's friendship. We were made to be in relationships. Number 2, we were made to create. We're creative people. So that's work, that's arts, that's building, Tower of Babel, which was bad, but this is what humans do. We create. Number 3, I tried to do another 8. So I say cultivate, meaning we're designed to grow. We're designed to learn and grow. And I actually talk about this somewhat in the book with the arts. I think we'll continue to create beautiful things in eternity. So back to friendships. Why would God create us to relate only to be in eternity and not do those things? It wouldn't make any sense. The church, friendships, relationships, it is, we saw the detriment during the pandemic of not being able to hug one another, not be able to have coffee or lunch together. We saw Zoom church, and it was necessary for a time. But what we want to do is be back together and serve one another and wash each other's feet and love one another, right? Okay, so back to the friendship issue. I mean, I struggle with this as an introvert. I struggle with this as a busy person. But I would say, I think we all know that longing. People have said for introverts, there's this myth that we don't like people. That's not actually true. That's not true, Nika. It's not that we don't like people. We don't like small talk.
Yeah.
We don't like the fakery and sort of the superficiality of how conversations happen at a party, for example. But if I could, I like spending time with a person, whether it's my wife or a good friend or my kids, that sort of thing. So when it comes to relationships, putting my pastor's hat on, I would say there are different types of relationships, and it's helpful to know that. There are going to be relationships of shared interests, and that's okay, and that's a place to begin. So if that's going to a rock climbing place and just getting involved, like, that's one way to do it, and that's one way to find community. It could be coworkers. Another type of friendship I talk about in the book, this comes from Aristotle, is a more deeper type of like soul level friendship. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, and that's what people hunger for. Number 1, you have to find like-minded people. That's one. Number 2, you have to make a commitment. Both of those things are real. So at my church, I go to a church called Bridgetown here in Portland, and we do a curriculum called Practicing the Way, which is getting our faith not only into our words, but into our bodies and our habits. So my wife and I made the decision to join and lead a community group. It's a weekly commitment. It's a lot. People want to do it a month or every 2 months, but it's weekly. And you're starting relationships from ground zero. And we didn't know most of the people in our group, but you make a commitment to one another. So I'd say find a context where you can take those challenging steps. Churches do try to provide them. You just have to take those steps of making a commitment. And maybe that means I'm not going to work as much. Maybe that means I have to just do something that's really scary and difficult. And maybe it means you try it and it doesn't work. And that happens too.
Yeah.
But this idea that you go to church, you listen to a sermon, you go home, and that was church, that's such an impoverished perspective compared to what Paul actually does. One of my favorite parts about that chapter, Nika, is looking at Paul himself as a friend. I used to think of Paul as a Lone Ranger apostle because he gives the stink eye to Peter and he drops John Mark, and he and Demas have a falling out. So you have you get this impression, but when I actually started to count Paul's friendships, he's always with people. He's always commending people. He's always taking a chance on people. And so he had loads and loads of friends. He had friends everywhere. And that was a crucial part of his ministry. So we can't use Paul as a model of the Lone Ranger leader, the Lone Ranger Christian. But think like he lived with Priscilla and Aquila for like a year and a half. So it wasn't like he was like, oh, I'm going to like send a text or I'm going to sort of meet up with this person once a month. I mean, he really did share life with people. I think the key is recognizing when you step into something like this, it's going to be hard and it's going to take a lot of time. You can't form friendships overnight, but sometimes you gotta be the person to start it. If it doesn't already exist in your church.
I totally agree. You mentioned a couple of years ago, after the pandemic, and we are still in the midst of what sociologists call the loneliness epidemic. And I remember the Surgeon General came out and was like, "Look, have y'all tried church? I'm not even saying for religious reasons. I'm just saying because you might make a friend there."
Relationships,
and so, yeah. Okay, my absolute favorite chapter was the one on athletics. You can't have the name Nika Spaulding and not be associated with sport. And so, I just wanted to rib you a little bit in your chapter to set up our audience for how I'm ribbing you. You talk about how Paul uses sport as a metaphor for the Christian life, and we can learn a lot from sport about perseverance and resilience. So my hard-hitting question, do esports count? Does a video game count for this chapter?
Oh, Paul would be so disappointed. Paul would be so... There's a conference I go to in Chicago, and we tend to meet at this hotel the same weekend every year. And the last 2 times we were there was an esports competition going on in the hotel at the same time we were meeting. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and they buy flavored popcorn, and they it's very serious. It's this gigantic room with computers, and oh boy, I would say that chapter really is about competition. So I guess loophole here in a sense, because I think about my daughter's in choir, and so that's sort of a competitive thing, and I think that some of the things will apply from that. But I grew up in a immigrant household. My parents came from India, and they worked really hard, and in their culture, sports are mostly seen as entertainment. Mm-hmm. They're not seen as life contributing to like a well-lived life. So I grew up with that mentality that sports are basically a waste of time. I played a little bit of tennis. I was terrible at it, but I did. But then, when I started dating my wife, we got married. She's a super athlete. She swims several times a week. She runs. She's triathlete. She does everything. She coaches soccer. She coaches basketball. She coaches track and field. And then my kids started doing sports, so I started really getting into it. And as I got into it again, paired with studying Paul, I realized in the ancient world, probably like today, people were obsessed with sports. Yeah. No one more than the Greeks were obsessed with sports. And really, I became a believer that at its best, Sports really is about maturing.
Hmm.
And I saw this with my kids, especially right after the pandemic, where relationships were frazzled and challenged, but these coaches were key mentors in my kids' life. And what you have with sports are things like learning how to work as a team, learning how to deal with failure, learning how to challenge yourself, getting disciplined or punished. Hey, you haven't come to practice the last couple times. You got to sit on the bench. Stuff like that. Getting injured and having to deal with that. My son broke his collarbone recently, and he was out for the season for tennis and soccer.
Hmm.
That's a huge life lesson. Huge life lesson. And so Paul loves sports metaphors. And actually, someone asked me recently, like, would he have been at the Isthmian Games? I talk about this in the book a little bit. The Isthmian Games were like a smaller version of the Olympics. They took place in Corinth. And yes, he would have been in Corinth at that time. And because he is a wage-earning retailer, chances are he's going to be there. Now, he's not, going to get involved in all the paganism, but, in order to really pull off these metaphors well, you have to have probably witnessed some of this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
If not live action, then you have to have witnessed it in painting, sculpture, art, literature. I mean, all this stuff, just like today, it suffuses all of our literature and art, right? Sports. It would be for him. So part of what I wanted people to do in the book is just imagine Paul's real life.
Hmm.
He's not sitting in an office
Yeah.
like me, banging away on a computer. He is out and about the world. I mean, who knows if he's writing a letter at a table at the Isthmian Games. We have no idea,
Yeah.
but he's out and about. He was a Renaissance man. He's all over the place. And he uses imagery from music, drama, sports. And I get really fired up thinking about that because I want people to be inspired by this book to take some of these topics and say, gosh, theology isn't just an interesting mental exercise.
Hmm.
I hate when people come up to me at a conference or whatever and say, I'm really interested in theology, because that usually means conspiracy theories. I'm really interested in theology. That's usually the person I don't want to talk to because they have a lot of opinions and I just don't want to have a big argument. What I want people to do is to say the Bible was written not to help me get away from the mundane stuff in life, but to bring the goodness, vitality, wisdom of God precisely to those things, to claim all those things for Jesus so we can make people's lives better, bring hope to this world, rebuild it. And I think sports actually play a part of that. I've actually taken a 180 on this from the 15-year-old, 18-year-old me to say, I wish I would have done sports, because I could totally see, whether it's an individual sport or a group sport, the challenge to overcome obstacles and make yourself better translates. Paul does that. He says, "Oh, it's of usefulness, but it's better for godliness." He's not trying to play down sports. He's trying to play up how this applies to your whole life. But it's not nothing that he says this is of some value. He's saying that because it was pervasive in society, and there is value in it.
Yeah, it's so good. There's now a sports chaplaincy program at Baylor, and every time I see it or it comes across my newsfeed or whatever, I think,
what were your sports? What were your go-to sports?
I chose sports I was too short for, so I was a very good volleyball player, even though I was short. I played a lot of basketball, and I threw discus. So all the sports were being long and lean, and I'm just short and stocky. So I had no wisdom.
Libero, you could be a libero, and you could dominate.
True. That is true. And I think to your point, Nijay, like I say this, and I really believe like sports saved me in my childhood. Yeah. It's the thing that kept me out of trouble. And I saw a stat the other day. It was something like 80% of women who are in the C-suites of their company were athletes. Like they played some sort of organized sport. And I think that speaks to this idea of, not that everybody in the C-suite's mature, but it does build these things in maturity that all
overcoming obstacles. Yeah.
All the things. And so Okay, your last chapter, you talk about creativity, and you had mentioned this earlier, and I think this is so good because I come from a background where my appreciation of beauty and art and all of that was so malnourished. Like it was sort of like,
Mm,
that's extra stuff. That's for, art is for the dreamers, but I'm trying to do the real work, the real holy work. And
yeah.
you do such a beautiful job. And I had never thought about Paul's use of architecture. I was thinking about a trip to Paris once, and we took a cab out to Palace of Versailles, and the cab driver's like, "Do you have something like this in Texas?" And I was like, "No, no, we don't have a palace in Texas." And
Yeah, right.
so, yeah, to that end, how would you, thinking through beauty and art and all of that, for so many people, that's such a foreign language. How would you encourage people to bring that into their lives, their ministries, their teaching? How to get more art, how to get more beauty in our lives?
Yeah, great question. I'll start out with a little background on that chapter, and it comes up earlier in the race chapter. You go to Rome and Athens today, and I'm a big archaeology nerd and armchair nerd in terms of wanting to see the ruins, see, some of these key historical sites. And what do you see? You see blanched white broken columns
Yeah.
and white statues. And what do you assume? You assume that they were designed that way. And so you have that image in your head of the classic white Greco-Roman civilization art. And we've only discovered in the last 20, 30 years is those things were not actually designed as white. They were painted with very bright colors. And you can actually go online and Google, polychromatic Greco-Roman art, and you'll see how almost awkwardly, overly colorful, and maybe even in our minds ugly these statues were, because they were very bright red and gold and all these bright colors, purple. And what happened is over time, these things wore down, and all that was left was the white. Or we learned that even sometimes as recently as the 1930s. The color was scraped off to look more white.
Yeah.
So that's a whole different conversation. But even buildings, I learned this while I was writing the book, they would be decorated, especially, civic buildings, expensive buildings, not houses, but not regular people's houses, but things where you have more money to invest in. They're going to have some coloring. They're going to be decorated with plants and with gold and with jewels or whatever. It's an entirely more beautiful and ornate. I heard this once. I don't know if it's true, so this totally could be a myth. But I heard, in the United States, this is true. We have overground power lines. We have one right outside our house, and it's super ugly, and I hate it. But in Europe, they bury their power lines because they don't want it to clog up the landscape. So you're not going to look around and just see lots of power lines. They're underground. And I think that is a lesson in sort of thinking through how the Romans constructed their world. They wanted it to be, when you go to a big city, they want you to just see beauty all around you. Mm. And we could talk about the economics of it, and exploitation of labor and all that, of course. But we have to change our mentality about some of this, about what kind of world Paul grew up in, what kind of world he lived in. So on to the art question. Every now and again, people will come up to me after I speak at a seminar, and they'll say, people from the church, they'll say, Nijay, you should go to such and such a church because they're expository preaching. And I sometimes refer to this as suppository preaching, because expository preaching in some places can just be sort of like boring Bible study, where you're just sort of doing verse by verse exegesis. I love verse by verse exegesis, but I want a sermon to be inspiring also. And sometimes I feel like what passes for expository preaching can be very lazy. I remember hearing from a scholar, a Hebrew Bible scholar named, I think, Robert Alter. He created a translation of the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible. It's a humongous endeavor. And I remember listening to an interview, and he said in that interview, someone asked him why he wanted to create his own translation when there are lots of translations already in existence. And he said, traditional Bible translators, which include Nijay Gupta, are trained in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. They're trained in exegesis, they're trained in history and archaeology, but they're not trained in literature.
Mm.
And that really stayed with me. I heard that 3 or 4 years ago. It really stayed with me. That's true. And he said the Bible is a artistic product. It's full of artistry from beginning to end. There's really nothing in there that's not touched by literary beauty. And so we need translators that are able to appreciate that and translate that to be artistic. I mentioned sometimes on podcasts that I'm a fan of the Message Bible, and people are shocked because shouldn't Bible translators favor literal translations? No, because often literal translations suck all the creativity out of it. What the ancient writers were doing, what the ancient Bible writers were doing is they were using these beautiful cultural images from their own time to communicate the Bible's truths, the gospel's truths. And when we put those into our time verbatim, and they don't land with readers unless we give them a seminary education, I think that's a problem. And so I'm not saying that everyone should use the Message Bible as their personal Bible at all times, but I love that Peterson leans into recognizing the creative aspect of the Bible and trying to appreciate that. For much of my early Christian life, Nika, I read the Bible for information. I read the Bible to get all the data, the who, what, where, why, when, and how. And really through the work of Eugene Peterson, his book, Eat This Book, he really convinced me, sort of bringing all these thoughts to the surface, that the Bible isn't designed just for information, it's designed for formation, and formation often comes through inspiration. And inspiration usually comes through art. And so that's why we hum that worship song in the middle of the week and not think through the sermon necessarily, because music is, a very potent form of art. And so you kind of asked me, what are marching orders for pastors? It's a skill you develop to be able to consume art well. It's a skill you develop, kind of like developing a taste. Certain foods. I didn't really drink coffee until seminary, and through my wife and through others, I developed a more refined palate. I used to drink the mocha, macchiato, caramel macchiato,
all the sugar,
milkshake coffee. Yeah. And I developed a taste, for coffee. And I think you could do that with art. You could do that with visual art. You could do that with music. You can do that obviously with film. So I would say, number one, pastors should be challenged to do this. It's not just fluff. It's actually how the Bible was designed. Think about this. The average ancient personal letter was about half a page long. Paul wrote 30 times that to the Romans. Why? He had a lot of content to convey. Yes, but he also has liturgy in there. He also has these beautiful kind of engagements with the Old Testament. He goes far beyond conveying information. He uses rhetorical questions. He used the diatribe form. He's all over the place with that stuff. He's an artist. He's a word artist. So how can we develop that? So things for preachers, it should happen on the study end, I think, of someone like Malcolm Guite, who's a poet. Read to Malcolm Guite for Pete's sake. Yeah. I've had to just grow in this area of reading more poetry and just be patient, listen to it over and over again. I'm trying. I do better with music, so trying to find hymns or songs that are going to resonate with those themes. Poetry is probably the hardest for me. I do try. Visual art I do really well with. I love Rembrandt. I love Baroque art. But then even in your sermons, I've actually tried doing kind of fictional narrative stuff. It doesn't always land. I'm not always the best at it. But recognizing our messages at church can have a bigger impact if we imitate what the biblical writers are doing. and they're often integrating creativity into it's out of the box. I remember talking to a Christian leader, and he's like, I would be run out of town if I started to do that stuff, because they're used to a very formulaic form of teaching. And so it might require some education for your congregation to say, like, maybe we should sit and watch Godspell together to learn a little bit about how to put creativity in our study of the Bible. But
start sneaking in Rembrandt on your slideshow on Sunday. Just sneak it in there. Something.
I think a little bit could go a long way, and pastors can exercise leadership in that area of saying, like, you read the book of Jeremiah, he is really long. And he repeats himself a lot, but it's so creative. I'm reading this book of Revelation commentary. Revelation is, it's just like mind-blowing cosmic fantasy novel, like mind-blowing stuff. You just think, couldn't there be a clearer way to say all this? And John is like, no, this is the way to do it. It's got to be Lord of the Rings style, 3.5 hours per movie. You got to soak it all in.
Love it. Well, we just have one question from the audience, which is perfect, I think, actually on timing. And so I'll just kick it over to you. Does the book engage at all with politics or government in your conversation on, the stuff of life?
Yes, definitely the justice chapter does. I actually wrote a bonus essay for my launch team. There's a group of people that were reading the book with me in the weeks running up to the book's release. I wrote this bonus essay, What Does Paul Think About the Roman Justice System? And I'm not going to spoil it all now, because I will at some time release that essay. But I will say, people, I learned this from my friend Esau McCauley, people will often point to Romans 13 as the go-to text for how Christians should engage with the government. Romans 13, obey all governing authorities. God has granted them the sword. They're servants of God, and all that. That is one thing he says, and it's important, but it's actually not the only thing he says. So you have to combine that perspective, which is respect and submit to government and authorities, assuming they're not calling you to sin. They're not forcing you to sin in some way, right? You have to combine that with a couple other things. So I'm just going to kind of tease some of these. One is he was a man constantly imprisoned.
Yeah.
So as a man constantly imprisoned, is he giving 2 thumbs up to the Roman justice system? No. You read the book of Acts, he is constantly defending himself. And he's saying, accuse me, please. I have this... whenever I teach on Paul in the book of Acts, when he gets arrested, and he almost sees getting arrested as like a free ride to Rome. I think he's just like, oh, you want to take me for free? Yeah, let's go. Like, and I almost think there's this old Bugs Bunny cartoon where Bugs is supposed to be in jail and he's wearing handcuffs, but he can slip out of the handcuffs whenever he wants. So he'll take out the handcuffs sometimes, and then he'll realize people recognize he can get out of the handcuffs, he'll put them back in. And I think Luke's trying to convey this about Paul, where he is being arrested, but he kind of knows that it's kind of a sham. And so I think we have to combine obey all governing authorities. Esau says we have to look also at Exodus, where you have these slaves protest the government, Pharaoh, saying, heck no. That's the liberation aspect. But then also for Paul himself saying, hey, accuse me. What do you got? And kind of going along with it, but recognizing that it is not just, it is not fair, it should not have happened. One of my favorite examples is when he's in Philippi. They arrest him unjustly. He's a Roman citizen. He has rights. And then they say, okay, we're sorry. It's like a teenager. Okay, we're sorry. Can you just go and stop talking? He's like, no.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you an earful. I'm going to give you an earful because you guys screwed it up. And to me, that's like permission to be bold when you feel like someone who has more power has got it wrong. I think the book of Acts gives us permission to be bold. We have to be discerning. Sometimes Paul leaves, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he defends himself, sometimes he doesn't. So we have to be discerning, but I do talk about it in the book. I will eventually circulate this bonus essay. I think the bigger picture that Paul has is Christians are not anarchists. We're not anarchists. We're not meant to go off and live by ourselves away from culture. We're not meant to create our own separate society. At the same time, we recognize the sinfulness of humanity, the sinfulness of our leaders, the sinfulness of our mayors, the sinfulness of our police officers. They're not as sinful as they could possibly be, and that's important to say. And I think Paul is trying to say that in places like Romans 13.
Mm.
He's saying an unbelieving governor can still run society well, can still contribute to common good. They're not as sinful as they could possibly be, but that doesn't mean that they're incapable of wrong. And Paul's seen that all the time, as he mentions with the court system. You know, this is sinful nature. Sinful nature or sinful desires is going to manipulate and twist and be broken. And so we have to recognize that. I think that's really healthy in the climate we live in, of both the attitude of Christians should not participate in civic society because we're better than them. Paul doesn't say that.
No.
And we have to turn this nation into a Christian nation from the top down. Paul definitely doesn't say that. We are a ground up sort of people, and we want to do all the good we can, bring all the justice and equality we can. But yeah, good question. I do talk about that. Wait for this bonus essay. If you follow my Substack, Good Advertisement, Engaging Scripture, you'll eventually see that bonus essay appear.
I love it. All right. As we're winding down this time, because I know we got to shut it down, what's just one takeaway you really want the reader to come away with when they finish your book?
I think the big takeaway is this world is the plan. Yes, God's going to do some pretty powerful things. Yes, he's going to recombine heaven and earth. Read the book of Revelation. It's pretty clear there. But plan B isn't we escape to heaven. It's still plan A. God's still committed to plan A. So don't use your spirituality to retreat, to escape, to kind of get on a rocket to Mars. Read the Bible, pray, turn to Jesus, and ask, how do I walk in the newness of life in the here and now?
That's so good, Nijay. All right, friends. And he didn't give you enough. He did not spoil the book. There is so much more for you if you go pick up this book. So Brazos, Northern, thank you so much for hosting this webinar. Nijay, after you said after one evening, you get bored and you need to connect is now how I understand how you write so many books, because you're not vegging out the whole weekend like the rest of us mortals. So it's good to know. But friends, thanks for joining us on this webinar. I'm sure Ralph, who's been controlling this, will flash the QR code one more time for you all to be able to pick up the book, but I highly recommend it. And if you're interested in theological education, you can learn from Nijay anytime you want if you enroll at Northern. And so they've got New Testament in the Masters. They've got a doctoral program. Nijay, is there anything else you want to tell people about Northern or your Substack or Seminary Now?
I'll also just, mention Seminary Now. If you want to just dip your toes into the seminary world, check out the either anytime study courses through Seminary Now, or they also have live courses for people that just want to try out a seminary class. So you could check it out through Seminary Now, or you can just dive in at Northern with us, with me and my colleague Matt Bates and the other wonderful folks we have at Northern. Thank you, Nika, for doing this. Thank you for how you've used your education in ministry and to get people to read their Bibles.
Absolutely. Love it. Thanks, friends. Thanks for joining us.